I'm going to tell you a little bit about not only the legal radio, but the illegal radio that McMinnville and Warren County had. I was involved in both. Back in 1947, WMNT went on the air. Prior to that, Southern Standard had been writing about the station, and a lot of us kids were really enthusiastic about it and wanted to get involved. We just thought that would be the greatest thing in the world to be on the radio. Good friends of mine who were also with me in the Gold and Silver Band were Aaron and Harold Durham. And Aaron decided to have a pirate radio station.
Welcome to another edition of Community Insider. Join us as we travel Middle Tennessee, uncovering history and experiencing the adventure of unique stories and events coming to you inside your community.
Good afternoon. I'm Mary Dawn Ray Bixby, and I just happen to be the program. Oh, there's a microphone. I didn't even see it. The program vice president, I think that's my title. So I get to do something today that I've always wanted to do, and that's to say that I get to introduce somebody who needs no introduction. I've always wanted to say that, and if ever there were a person that way, it's Dr. Roan. I'm going to let him fill you in on most things, but I'll just give you a few highlights. His father was Jimmy Roan, his mother was Grace, and they owned Exchange Furniture, which was in the Sedberry Hotel, and they were friends of my parents, as his wife, Elizabeth, who I'm so sorry couldn't be here today. Her parents were Dr. Mason and Elizabeth Mason, who were also good friends of my parents. So we kind of go back a long way, and it's those connections are wonderful. He became involved in radio when he was in the 8th grade. I'll let him tell you how old he is so you'll know how long ago that's been. I never like to reveal people's ages. And that was with WMMT. Then, of course, he went to UT Knoxville, and then he went to UT in Memphis to medical school. He was involved at one time, see, I'm trying to read my writing, and I can't write very well, but he was in the Air Force. He was involved with WBMC. Many of you, probably all of you, know that he was mayor of McMinnville for 16 years, which I can't even imagine doing that. And then in 1997, he established WCPI. So he has a long history of involvement with radio, with McMinnville, with governance and volunteer work, and we're delighted to have him here today to talk to us. So let's give Dr. Roan a big hand.
Thank you, Mary Dawn. That sounds like something my mother would write. I appreciate that very much. It's a real privilege to be here today and talk a little bit about Warren County radio. I can borrow from Richard and Regina. I'm going to call this Communications Evolution, because it basically deals with communications in this community that goes way back and to the present time. I'm a little bit humbled by the number of talented people who are in this room who have been in radio and have taken part in our local radio programs over the years. So bear with me, folks, if I don't get the dates right. I'm in my 88th year. We got that out of the way now. That's why they called me. They wanted somebody old to do this. They could remember. I'm going to tell you a little bit about not only the legal radio, but the illegal radio that McMinnville and Warren County had. I was involved in both. Back in 1947, WMMT went on the air. Prior to that, Southern Standard had been writing about the station, and a lot of us kids were really enthusiastic about it and wanted to get involved. We just thought that would be the greatest thing in the world to be on the radio. Good friends of mine who were also with me in the Gold and Silver Band were Aaron and Harold Durham. And Aaron decided to have a pirate radio station. Now, I don't know how he got his together, but he did. And he broadcast in the neighborhood, which was legal enough. That was all right to do that. And I don't think it lasted very long. And then I came along, and Mr. I.D. Byers, who was at that time had just come back from the Navy, worked with my father at the furniture store. They were putting in a radio repair shop. Now, I don't know whether you can remember things like that or not. This was before the days of the required obsolescence that we run into today, where you throw something out and get something new. If you had a bad radio, or if it went out, you take it in and get it fixed. They had to put in a tube, or they'd wire up something. But can anybody remember those days? Okay, we got folks in here that do. All right. So he was talking to me about it, and I said, I sure would like to do something like that and get some training. And he said, well, we can wire you up with a little transmitter, no problem. So he worked with me over a few weeks and put together a minor little 5-watt transmitter. And he said, now you can broadcast from the house, and it'll just cover your family and the neighborhood. You're not getting out doing anything wrong. So we put it together, got my record player, got a microphone, an amplifier, set me up a little board so it would work like a real radio station. And two of my good friends, lifelong friend, Judge Charles Haston, he and I grew up together. He was a week older than me, and he passed not too long ago, and I'm certainly missing him. But he came over to help me out during the summer. What we did was we'd sit down in my garage with this transmitter, and we'd have a good time. We'd read the paper. We'd read the newspaper, and we would play records and just have all kinds of fun, you know. Well, Chuck came over one day. He lived 2 blocks away. And then Jimmy Jones, Dr. James Jones, later, I don't know whether anybody ever remembers him or not, but he was also a friend. He came over, and we put it together, and he said, you know, I can't get it at my house either. He lived up on Ross Avenue. I lived down on Lynn Street. So I said, well, you know, Mr. Byers told me that the main deal here is the antenna. I said, all it's got is a 6-foot wire, and that's not doing much good. I said, let me hook it up a little bit longer. Well, unbeknownst to everybody, including Mr. Byers, Mama had a 50-foot clothesline in the backyard, all wire. And I ran my little wire and hooked it to that. Folks, our radiating power was magnificent. We were all over the county. We were getting cards and letters from people thanking us for the new radio station that had come on the air. And about that time, Chuck's daddy, Mr. Haston, was a prominent attorney at the time. He was talking to us one day, and he said, fellas, I tell you what, I think you just may be doing something illegal here. And he said, the FCC takes a dim view of people doing that sort of thing. So the summer was nearly over, and we stopped that. But I always thought that was something we've enjoyed thinking about it over the years. WMMT went on the air in 1947. They were the McMinnville Broadcasting Company, and the station was founded by Drs. Ollie and Sam Albritton, were the primary investors, and the Richard brothers, Royce and Ernie Richards from Sparta. Their father was a dentist. I imagine that's how they all got together to start with. And it came on the air in 47. I didn't work there until 49, and the way I got involved was my dad was advertising, as Mary Dawn had indicated, was advertising the furniture business on the radio. And Daddy talked him into letting me do a 30-minute program twice a week, played records, read commercials, did that sort of thing. And that's how I got involved to start with. And then finally, Royce Richards, I just bugged him so much that he finally let me come on and work part-time. And he had always been really good about having part-time school kids. Harold Durham, and that's a really famous name from McMinnville. he was the first one, and then Aaron, his brother, and then they were friends of mine, and I got in with the crowd, and that's how I got into the radio station to start with. And I would work on weekends, and basically that was my contribution to local radio at that time. I stayed with that until I graduated from high school, and then I went off to college, and I came back home after the first year to get married. We decided, my wife and I had been lifelong friends and decided we wanted to get married. And she'd been off to Missouri to college, and I'd been to UT, and we decided to go ahead and get married. And I was going to go back to school. That was the plan. But Uncle Sam intervened, and I'll tell you about that in a few minutes. But during that summer, Mr. Byers came to me and said, we're getting ready to start up a new station, WBMC. He and Joe Mattis and Dr. Cope at the time got together and put up the money for it. And it was a 500-watt daytime-only station at that time. But anyway, he asked me if I would work with him during that summer, or actually the spring, and take the semester off and work to get it on the air, because I'd had some experience and had done some announcing. And he was a good friend, so I did that. Well, we got it on the air, and after that, I was gone. I was getting ready to go back to school, and one day my dad, who was the chairman of the Selective Service Committee in Warren County, told me, he said, you may as well just cool it. He said, you're getting ready to be drafted. Because during that time frame, they were calling up people to go to the service. And he said, but you don't have to go to the Army. If you want to go do something else, you can go ahead and enlist. So I enlisted in the Air Force, and that's what I did for the next 8 years. 4 active duty years, and then 4 years in inactive duty with the active reserves. And then at that point, I pretty much had retired from radio. So let me tell you a little bit more about radio locally after that time. After WBMC went on the air, and I'll tell you a quick story about that too before we get any further. Remember Chick Brown? Chick was pretty famous in these parts as a newsman. He had been with MacArthur when he returned to the Philippines. Has anybody ever seen the pictures of that group? Yeah. Okay, all right, it's pretty famous, Well, it turns out, he was telling us about it, he said MacArthur was pretty much a ham, and he said he had them all to do this thing 3 or 4 times. They had to get off of the LST, wade to shore, and get it filmed, and that whole thing before he liked what he saw. But anyway, the Chick was going to be the general manager of WBMC, and one of the side stories that was interesting about that, he was a great newspaperman, a great writer, and but when he came to the radio, he was afraid to actually do the broadcasting. He didn't feel like he had the voice for it. And we kept telling him, you're going to do fine, Chick, please just get in there and do it. And he made us record it 3 or 4 times so he could listen to it before he finally bit the bullet and started doing the news work. And quite frankly, I don't know whether anybody would agree with me or not, but over the years, he was probably one of the best announcers that WBMC ever had. He really was. Thought the world of him. And after we got the station on the air, and by the way, I want to clear up something that's always been a controversial item, and that's what was the first record ever played on WBMC. I happened to be on the air and put it on the air that Sunday morning in May, and it was a Blackwood Brothers, I'll Fly Away Home. I've heard people tell every other song in the world, but that's what it was. After the WBMC went on the air, there's several years there, and we had another FM station, WHNR. That was our first FM station in McMinnville, and it was owned and operated by Harold and Charles Roney. And there may have been other investors, I'm not sure. And our dear friend here, Bill Zeckman, was one of the announcers. Is that right, Bill? Yeah. Did you do the news and all that stuff? Everything. Everything. Had to do everything. Yeah, I was going to tell you a little bit about that in a minute. But then going on through the different stations, then that became later on, I think that was sold to Mr. White, and it became WTRZ and on from there. And then also WMMT was sold out and they changed the call letters to WAKI. So that kind of brings you up to date. on the radio stations during that time frame. I went back to school, and when I got out of school, I came home and established a practice and did that for 55 years. And I closed my practice in 2019. I'm working again. I didn't stay retired very long, but I went back to work with another group because they said they needed some help. And then in 1997, we started WCPI, Warren County Education Foundation, and that's been 26 years. So we're still on the air. We're at 1,600 watts at our power. We're not the biggest in the world, but we do get out pretty well. Any questions so far that anybody'd like to throw out?
Hey, Doc.
Yo.
I understand you worked in radio in Knoxville.
Yeah, I did while I was at the University of Tennessee. This is interesting too, and I did mean to bring this story up. The Durham brothers, Harold was the oldest. He was about 4 years older than I, and his brother Aaron was a couple of years older. They all had worked at WMMT. Harold, when he graduated from school, he went to UT, and he got a job on the biggest station up there at the time in Knoxville, WNOX. Then Aaron graduated 2 years later, and he went to Knoxville to UT, and he got a job with WROL. And then I graduated a couple of years later, and when I went to Knoxville, I asked the Durham brothers, I said, is there any possibility I could get on radio somewhere around here on a part-time job? And they said, yeah, we got this new station that's coming on the air. It's called WIVK. It's just a little 5,000 watt station, directional and daytime only. So I did. I worked at that station while I was in school at UT at that time. And this is interesting to me. I hope you find this interesting. But my shift was on Sundays. I went in, and because I was in college and a student, I just worked on weekends. And I would go in at 5 o'clock in the morning and get it on the air. And from 5 o'clock until 1 o'clock in the afternoon, there was one religious group after another all morning long in each studio. I'd get one studio cleaned out and I'd have to put another group in. We went back and forth, back and forth. And by the time I got to 1 o'clock, I was exhausted. And there's no telling how many times I got saved. Going back to WMMT, though, some of the interesting things that happened during those years, Estes Kefauver was our senator back during those years. And he came to McMinnville a lot because this was a vacation place for him. He loved what was known as Shangri-La, and it's out on the way to Morrison, out on Hickory Creek. And that old building, I think it's still out there, I believe. But they would come and spend a lot of their vacation times here. He would come down to WMMT and go live to Washington, D.C. and make his weekly reports. Because that brings to mind the big thing here was everything we did in radio then was live. There were no recordings. I mean, when I first started, WMMT finally got a recording, got 2 tape recorders about a year after I started working there. But prior to that time, you go to work, you worked because you'd get a clipboard filled with commercials. And then you'd follow the log, whatever programming was going to take place, you'd do it, and you'd read. You read, and these folks nowadays don't do that anymore. They put it all on tape, and they can just sort of plug it in when they need to, So it's been a great deal of change into technology. I'll never forget that. And then one other story that I always found was interesting was getting back to Chick Brown again in MacArthur. The general came after he got relieved of duty in the late 40s, he came back to Murfreesboro because his wife, Jean Faircloth, lived in Murfreesboro all of her life, and so they came back for a visit. So it's big news. Everybody in the state was talking about the General Mack was coming home. So we decided to do a remote broadcast. WMMT did. All right, now in those days, it's not like it is today. Now, Bill can go out and do a remote, and he's got a little telephone, he picks it up, and he's on the air. Well, then you had to have dedicated phone lines, and you had to have your amplifying equipment and all right there. So they called ahead, and they had 3 different places along the parade route. because that's what they were going to do, have a big parade for the general and go and then wind up at the Faircloth Mansion and that sort of thing. So my job, I was in the last one as they came down the street. And all I did was just say, here he comes, he's passing by, and, you know, describe the color and what they were doing. And Chick was there. Of course, he had been with the general earlier in the service. And so we got to the end of the parade, and I wasn't very far from the house, so I trotted over there, got on the sidewalk where they were going to come in, had a microphone, you know, and looking real important, and had my little badge on that I was in the media. And when he was passing by on the sidewalk, the general looked at me, and I guess he thought, what's this kid doing here, you know? And he tapped me on the shoulder and said, nice to see you, young man, and went on in the house. I still got that shirt. That pretty well brings me up to date, except I'll talk about one other thing here. I'd like to get some of you all to make some comments, if you would, those of you who have worked in our local radio stations over the years. But back in my day, they were just beginning to come up with radio names for the announcers. Why they did that, I have no idea. But we've got a famous one here today, Rocky McKnight. That's Richard Myers. And I'm sure everybody, are there others that had radio names that you remember that were here?
Tom actually dubbed me with that name.
Oh, did he?
Yes.
Okay. I walked in.
I'll tell you a story about.
Go ahead, please.
If you don't mind.
No, go ahead, Joe. Joe Kuhn, he's been involved with radio here for years.
Hey, Joe, could you come up?
Can you come up here?
I've already got your microphone.
If I can get up there, Bill, I've had hip surgery. Plus I
Bless your heart.
took a fall day before yesterday. That's the reason I planted myself beside Dr. Bigby here in case
he fell.
I got down.
I need all the advertising I get.
Joe, the sea doesn't part for you, but all your neighbors here, they parted for you.
Oh, man. The things that Norman told you is absolutely right. Talking about the Chick being down at the, I believe it was the Webb Hotel in Murfreesboro? I was right there. I laid out of school that day and went to see MacArthur. I was manager of WAKI. Roy Pearsall, which we all know here, was our engineer. And he got a job with Ben Lowman. And the owner of WAKI was Bill Leversey. He lived in Johnson City. And he had such a drive, and sometime we'd get off in the air and put us in a bind. Pearsall would come in a case of emergency. But he told me, he said, if I lived down there, I'd find me a talented kid and make an engineer out of him, get him some license. So I went out to Estill Myers' grocery store out in Newtown, and he advertised with me. And he said, I want to show you what my son's done. Took me back in there. And he had taken a pinball machine Richard had. He was about 12-year-old. He'd rigged up, it done everything. It took their picture, handcuffed them, and everything, you know, it's amazing. So I went right back to the station and called Bill. I said, I think I found your kid. He said, I'll be down there Sunday, have him to be at the station. And he went on to make one of the best engineers that we've ever had around here. He worked engineer at WDOD in Chattanooga, all of the radio stations around here. And he's here today in good health, and so good to see him.
If we could have all the radio personnel, we'd love to have every one of you stand up and tell us your name, and if you've got a good story to tell. I know there's good stories. I know you guys have good stories.
Norman went on the air, first voice, and played the gospel record. That was May, was it 5th?
May 5th.
May the 5th, in 55. And I went on the next morning at 5 o'clock with country music and gospel music and just old cornbread talk and stuff like that. And I'd done that for years. Then I left there and went to Florida and done television 5 years in Fort Myers. But I got started in everything through the fiddle playing. And I was Dottie West's fiddle player. I've got that picture here if anybody wants to see it. Yeah. Here was her high school band. That's Dottie West and me and Joe Bassam, Don Blankenship, Wayne York, and J.C. I can't think of it. All of them are dead now. But that's how I got into being a disc jockey. When WBMC went on the air, while Chick Brown came in McMinnville Hardware, I was working there then in 52 and 3 and 4, and sell advertising. And I talked him into letting me spin records. And at that time, there wasn't any country disc jockeys. Eddie Hill was one of the first at WSM. And so I kind of patterned him and got a lot of calls from English teachers and things like that about my language, but and the way I talked. But when Chick would go in a store and sell advertising, I remember being in there one day when he was in Norman's daddy's store. He sold him advertising, and he said, "I want them run on Joe's program, see?" And that's how I got started, is with old country talk. It came natural with me. And so I've been around a long time, 90 years. And if anybody wants to ask me any questions, I'll try to answer them. And Bill Zachman, he's always been around too.
Almost as long as you have, Joe.
Yeah. But a lot of my friends are here that I've worked with, and
Don't tell about that Tom Garman story, though.
Oh, don't tell about that.
There's some good Tom Garden stories. Tell them.
huh?
You tell them. You've been challenged to tell a Tom Garman story.
Don't tell that, Joe.
I thought you said tell it.
No, don't tell it. You can't tell that today.
No, I guess I better not. But anyway, Tom Miller there came from WJLE and went to work with me as a news director. And the first day he went out with me, they had a wreck out here on, I won't tell it all, on 70 Highway. And so we had a radio in our car. We'd broadcast from the scene. And that was his first go at that. We went out there and I'd love to tell it, but I can't.